Good evening, you horizontal masterpiece. Yes, you. The brave, slightly overcooked brain floating in blankets right now, probably thinking about something completely unnecessary, like whether you've paid that one bill, or if people can tell you don't really know what cloud storage is. You're here now, and that's enough. You're not here to plan or optimize or manifest your best self. You're here to relax and to drift off to sleep, while I tell you some of the weirdest, truest, and most deeply unnecessary moments in history. Because humans, we've always been gloriously messy. Tonight you'll hear stories of kings who started feuds through food, emperors who wore chandeliers on their heads, and jobs so bizarre they make consultant sound poetic. No pressure, no exams, no judgment. Just you, the pillow, and the knowledge that people in powdered wigs made way worse life decisions than you did today. So let's start at the banquet table, with a royal dinner so full of petty symbolism. It could have been a PowerPoint presentation in medieval lace. In the year 856, there lived a man called Charles the Bald. Now, no one really knows if he was actually bald. Some say he had hair. Some say he just gave off bald energy. But what we do know is this. He was one of the grandsons of Charlemagne, ruler of West Francia, and, most importantly, he was very tired of his brother's nonsense. Charles's half-brother, Louis the German, ruled the eastern chunk of the empire. They were meant to be diplomatic, brotherly, a united force. Instead, they were so not that. Louis kept undermining Charles. Charles kept pretending he didn't notice. And when diplomacy failed and bloodshed seemed likely, Charles did the most aristocratic thing possible. He threw a dinner party, but not just any dinner party. A symbolic, theatrical, incredibly pointed feast. The tables were overflowing with glistening roasts and fruit towers, stacked to architectural heights. Musicians played songs about betrayal and loyalty. There was a small theatrical performance in which a traitor brother is punished by falling into a metaphorical hole of his own making. It was not subtle. The guests sat there, sipping wine and chewing awkwardly while trying to figure out whether this was a celebration or an emotional hostage situation. Charles, naturally, smiled through it all, didn't say a word, just made sure everyone understood the vibe. It was possibly the most passive-aggressive dinner in medieval history, and it reminds us that before subtweets and vague Instagram quotes, there were feasts, lavish, wordless feasts, where the side dish was always drama. Now, as the clinking of royal goblets fades into the distance, we tiptoe from royal pettiness into the strange little alleyways of labor history, where people earned a living doing the weirdest things imaginable. Let's visit the forgotten jobs that made the world turn, one confused nose inspection at a time. So now that we've finished dessert at Charles the Bald's tension-filled dinner party, let's walk it off, out of the royal halls, down a cobbled street, into a quieter, stranger corner of history, where people once had jobs so bizarre, you'd think they were dares. Let's start with the very glamorous profession of the knocker-upper. No, not what you're thinking. A knocker-upper was a real job in Britain and Ireland before alarm clocks were a thing. These were men and women, often elderly or just very chronically awake, who wandered the streets in the early hours of the morning with long sticks, bamboo poles, or even pea shooters, tapping on bedroom windows to wake people up for work. Imagine trying to sleep through that. You're cozied up under 3 blankets, dreaming about not working, and suddenly there's an old man below your window aggressively poking your glass with a stick, like he's trying to summon a pigeon. And here's the kicker. Knocker-uppers often had to hire other knocker-uppers to wake them up, because even human alarm clocks hit snooze. But perhaps that's not your speed. Maybe you're more of a night owl. In that case, consider a career as a gong farmer. What is that, you ask? A gong farmer was a person in medieval England who climbed down into cesspits, full ones, and shoveled out human waste for disposal. Yes, they handled what others flushed, with a bucket and sheer willpower. They worked exclusively at night because no one wanted to see that happening, and while they were paid well for the time, they were socially avoided like the plague. Probably because they smelled like the plague. Still, they got the job done, one scoop at a time. Or perhaps you've got a flair for the dramatic. You want to be seen, heard, and emotionally felt by strangers. Might I suggest becoming a professional mourner? In ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, and honestly, up through Victorian times, wealthy families would hire people, usually women, to attend funerals and cry. Not politely, loudly, screaming, wailing, hair-pulling. Some would even throw themselves theatrically on the coffin, dramatically collapsing into fits of grief for someone they'd never met. Because in many cultures, the louder the mourning, the greater the honor to the dead. And let's be honest, if there's ever a time to be over the top, it's at a funeral where you're being paid to be emotional. These were jobs, serious, structured, and respected. So the next time you're updating your resume and wondering if "can cry on command" is a marketable skill, please know that, historically speaking, it absolutely was. And now, from window tapping to wailing to waist-deep waste removal, we leave the labor market behind and step into something even fluffier. Let's drift into the powdered, perfumed, wildly impractical world of historical wigs, where social status was measured in curls, powder, and a healthy tolerance for mice. By the late 1600s, Europe had collectively decided that natural hair simply wasn't dramatic enough. Enter the wig. But not just any wig. These weren't humble hairpieces for coverage or flair. These were towering powdered monuments to power, fashion, and the belief that your head could and should resemble a tiered wedding cake in a windstorm. It all began with King Louis XIV of France, who, upon noticing that his hairline was retreating faster than a soldier in winter, commissioned a wig so lush, so voluminous, it looked like it could host a family of birds. And because Louis was the ultimate trendsetter, soon the entire French court followed suit. Wigs became status symbols. The bigger, the better. The fluffier, the fancier. Men wore curly perukes that made their heads look like swirled butter sculptures. Women went even bigger, piling their wigs high and decorating them like museum exhibits. Some were styled with feathers, others with porcelain figurines or even miniature ships. Yes, actual ships with sails. One noblewoman famously arrived at a ball with a wig shaped like a naval battle scene, complete with rigging and a tiny flag, because nothing says elegance like looking like you just collided with a harbor. To keep them looking pristine, wigs were coated with powder, usually made from finely ground starch and scented with things like lavender or orange blossom, so your head could smell like a haunted bakery. And here's where it gets real. All that powder attracted lice. A lot of lice. To cope, people often shaved their natural hair completely, wore linen caps underneath, and tried not to think too hard about the ecosystem blooming on their scalps. There were even horror stories, whispered at salons and supper parties, of mice nesting in wigs at night. Some aristocrats started storing their wigs in cages beside the bed, like fashionable hamster condos. Now, obviously, this trend couldn't last forever. Wigs were expensive, they were uncomfortable, and eventually the French Revolution arrived with the force of 1,000 guillotines, and suddenly wearing a 4-foot-tall hair sculpture became less of a fashion statement and more of a life-endangering risk. Over time, the elaborate styles faded, the powder disappeared, and by the 1800s, wigs had quietly retired from society's main stage. But for one glorious, ridiculous moment in history, your hairstyle could literally say, "I own land, I drink too much wine, and I'm not afraid of birds building a nest in my head." So if you've ever worried about a bad hair day, or debated whether dry shampoo counts as personality, just know, at least you don't have to carry a naval fleet on your scalp. You're ahead of the game. Now, as the last of the hair powder settles, let's leave the dressing rooms behind and head somewhere a little louder. Because up next, we're visiting a town that danced without stopping for days, and not for joy, not for fame, but for reasons that nobody, even now, really understands. Let's go back to Strasbourg. It's summer, the year 1518. The town is quiet, warm, slightly musty, 16th century vibes. And then a woman walks into the street and starts to dance, not to music, not as a performance, just dancing, wildly, repetitively, furiously, in front of everyone, for hours. At first the neighbors probably thought, wow, she's really into whatever invisible beat she's hearing. But she didn't stop, not that day, not that night, not the next day either. She collapsed from exhaustion, then got up and kept dancing. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Men, women, children, all moving non-stop, spinning, stomping, swaying, collapsing, only to rise and begin again. Within a month, nearly 400 people were caught in what can only be described as a medieval flash mob gone rogue. People danced in the streets, in front of churches, on doorsteps and market squares. Some reportedly cried as they danced. Others laughed. Many begged for help, but couldn't stop. Physicians and priests gathered to consult. Some said it was an overheated brain. Others thought it was possession. The solution? More dancing. Yes, they built a stage, hired musicians, encouraged the afflicted to keep moving, thinking it would dance the illness right out of them. It did not. People collapsed from exhaustion. Some reportedly died from strokes, heart attacks, or pure physical burnout, and the town was left stunned. terrified, and very confused. Historians have debated this one for centuries. Some believe it was mass hysteria, triggered by stress, hunger, and the crushing anxiety of 16th century life. Others blame ergot, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye and can cause tremors and visions. Basically medieval LSD toast. A few even believe it was a ritual gone wrong, a curse, a punishment, or something far stranger. But whatever the cause, it happened. Hundreds of people dancing themselves into collapse under the summer sun. Eventually, the town brought in priests and shut down the music. The dancing slowly faded, and the plague passed, just as mysteriously as it began. So if your brain feels a little overworked tonight, if your thoughts are cha-cha sliding when you just want them to be still, remember Strasbourg. And be glad that your mind is buzzing quietly under a blanket, not break-dancing against your will in a cobbled courtyard. Sleep in peace. No music required. Now, as the rhythm winds down, we wander from twitchy feet to frothy chaos. Because next we're heading to 19th century London, where one neighborhood was unexpectedly swallowed by a flood of beer. Yes, really. It was a normal afternoon in London. The year was 1814. The skies were grey, the air smelled like smoke and horse, and in the working-class district of St. Giles, people were going about their day. And then, completely without warning, a tsunami of beer came crashing through the streets. Let's back up. At the time, beer wasn't just a pub thing. It was a serious, industrial-scale operation. The Moo and Company Brewery was one of the largest in the city, home to gigantic vats of dark porter ale, some of them over 20 feet tall. Each tank held thousands of barrels of beer, all sealed up tight with iron hoops, wooden planks, and if we're being honest, blind optimism. One of those tanks had a crack. Nobody thought it was a big deal, until one day, one of the iron bands suddenly snapped. The vat exploded with the force of a cannon, unleashing nearly 1.5 million liters of beer. The pressure shattered other nearby vats like angry dominoes, and within seconds, the entire building burst open, releasing a literal flood of alcohol into the neighborhood. Walls collapsed, basements filled. A massive wave of porter tore through homes and taverns, sweeping up furniture, barrels, and, unfortunately, people. 8 lives were lost, some drowned, others were crushed by debris, all of them victims of what historians now call one of the strangest industrial accidents in British history. And while some Londoners tried to help, others brought mugs. There are reports, unverified, but deeply believable, that people ran to the scene with pots and pans, scooping up free beer like it was divine intervention. Some even allegedly got sick from drinking the flood brew, which had been marinating in wood, dust, and very questionable floorboards. The courts ruled it an act of God, which is fascinating, because if ever there was a day when the divine might have been testing the limits of humor, it was the day an entire street was baptized in lukewarm porter. The brewery survived. It was rebuilt, and today the story of the Great Beer Flood lives on as a reminder that sometimes the world doesn't fall apart from war or scandal, but from too much beer in the wrong barrel. So tonight, if your day felt chaotic, if things overflowed and you felt submerged in nonsense, remember, You didn't have to wade through ale to get to your front door. And that, in the grand history of weird human moments, counts as a win. Now, as the puddles dry and the streets clear, let's head into the next chapter of chaos. Because up next, we're biting into a bright red scandal, one that once had Europe whispering in fear. Let's talk about the time people were absolutely convinced that tomatoes were trying to kill them. Today, the tomato is a trusted citizen of the culinary world. It lives peacefully in sandwiches, dances across pizzas, and bursts with charm in salads. But for centuries, especially in Europe, the tomato was considered dangerous, toxic, suspicious, possibly evil. Let's rewind to the 1500s, when European explorers were first bringing foods from the Americas back home. Alongside treasures like corn, potatoes, and hot peppers came a peculiar red fruit that looked like it had been designed by a passionate sculptor with a flair for drama. People were intrigued. It was glossy. It was juicy. But it was also from the nightshade family, a group of plants that included some very deadly relatives. So naturally, people were hesitant. And then came the real nail in the tomato's reputation. Rich people started dying after eating them. But here's the twist. It wasn't the tomato's fault. It was the plates. In the 1600s, the wealthy ate off pewter dishware, which, it turns out, contains lead. Tomatoes, being high in acidity, would leach the lead into the food. So when nobles sliced up a tomato and took a bite, they were unknowingly ingesting a lovely decorative dose of heavy metal. They'd get sick. Some died. And instead of blaming the toxic plates, everyone pointed a trembling finger at the tomato. It was dubbed the poison apple, which admittedly makes it sound like something from Snow White's lunch menu. The fruit was pushed aside, feared, planted mostly for decoration in gardens, admired but never eaten. A beautiful little death orb. Meanwhile, the working class, who couldn't afford pewter and used safer wooden or ceramic dishes, ate tomatoes without incident. They just didn't have the PR budget to tell anyone. It took a while, nearly 2 centuries, for tomatoes to shake their shady reputation. In the United States, it wasn't until the early 1800s that people finally began to trust the tomato again. One particularly dramatic boost came from a man named Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson who, legend has it, stood on the courthouse steps in Salem, New Jersey, and ate an entire tomato in front of a horrified crowd, just to prove it wouldn't kill him. People gasped. Women clutched pearls. A town doctor was reportedly standing by with smelling salts. And then, Johnson survived. He stood there, very much alive, probably wiping tomato juice off his mustache, and from that moment on, America began slowly embracing the tomato, one cautious salad at a time. So tonight, as you wind down from a long day, maybe with a snack beside you, take a moment to appreciate that your tomato isn't feared. It's trusted, loved, sauced, and celebrated, and also mercifully free of lead. Now, with our produce redeemed, let's step away from the garden and into the shadows of power. Because next up is one of the wildest stories ever whispered in the halls of history. The time a pope got so mad, he put a dead guy on trial. Yes, a real corpse sat on a throne in court, and yes, it actually happened. The year is 897. Rome smells like incense, politics, and probably too much wool. The church is powerful, volatile, and frankly, in its soap opera era, there are factions, betrayals, conspiracies. And in the middle of all this, someone says, "You know what would really send a message? Let's dig up the last pope and put him on trial." And somehow, everyone agrees. This is the story of Pope Stephen VI and his outrageously personal grudge against his predecessor, Pope Formosus. Formosus had already died, peacefully, presumably, and had been buried with all the proper papal honors. But Stephen, the new pope, did not like him. In fact, he really didn't like him. So Stephen decided to exhume Formosus's body, drag it into a courtroom, prop it up on a throne, and put it on trial for crimes against the church. This event actually happened. It's called the Cadaver Synod, and it might be the most unhinged use of courtroom drama in religious history. Monks carried in the body, dressed it in papal robes, and seated it upright in front of a panel of bishops. Stephen stood there, robe flowing, fury simmering, and yelled accusations at a corpse. A deacon was assigned to speak on the dead pope's behalf. Imagine being the guy hired to represent a decomposing defendant who could, quite literally, not defend himself. There's no training for that. And just to make things more surreal, the trial went on for hours. People asked questions, testimonies were given, all while the lifeless form of Formosus sat there, slumped slightly, probably smelling like historical regret. Eventually, the court found him guilty. Of what? It barely mattered. The important thing was the drama. His papal garments were torn off, his blessing fingers were chopped off, and his body was thrown, unceremoniously, into the Tiber River. It was brutal. It was symbolic. It was way too much. But karma, as it tends to do, returned with flair. Public outrage over the Cadaver Synod exploded. People were horrified. Riots broke out, and within a few months Pope Stephen VI was deposed and imprisoned, and later found strangled in his cell. Formosus was reburied. The church tried to pretend the whole thing didn't happen, but it did. A pope once held court over a skeleton in a chair, and now you know about it. So if you've ever been haunted by a passive-aggressive text or felt yourself overthinking a grudge, remember, you are not the one who exhumed a body to win an argument, and thank heavens for that. Now, as we gently lay the courtroom drama to rest, let's lighten things up, because our next story is less about wrath and more about complete misunderstanding. Up next, the day an entire country declared war on emus. Yes, the giant birds, and they won. Welcome to Australia, 1932. The sun is hot, the land is dry, and the farmers? The farmers are losing their minds, not over drought, not over taxes, but over emus. Now, if you've never had the pleasure of meeting an emu, here's a quick bedtime portrait. It's a flightless bird, 6 feet tall, 2-legged, feathers like a haystack, eyes like it's seen things and survived them. And it can run 30 miles per hour, silently, like a judgmental ostrich with a vendetta. After World War I, many Australian soldiers had returned home to farm government-issued land. But the soil was rough, the crops were failing, and just when things couldn't get worse, in came 20,000 emus. migrating west in search of food and water. They found the farmlands and thought, yes, this is ours now. They began trampling wheat, knocking over fences, and generally birding all over everything. Farmers tried to scare them off, but emus are not easily intimidated. They looked at scarecrows like cute. Desperate, the farmers went to the government, who responded in true 1930s fashion. Let's send the military. Yes, the actual military, with machine guns. 2 soldiers and a truck full of ammunition were dispatched to rural Western Australia to deal with the emu problem. What followed is now officially referred to as the Great Emu War. It did not go well. The emus, being large but extremely agile, scattered before they could be targeted. The soldiers opened fire and missed, or hit a few, but the birds kept running. Some were wounded and just ran faster, now angry and aerodynamic. At one point, the soldiers mounted a machine gun on a moving truck, thinking they could drive and shoot at the same time. Spoiler, they could not. The terrain was too bumpy, the gunner couldn't aim, and the emus, probably holding tiny little invisible protest signs, escaped again. After several humiliating days, hundreds of wasted bullets, and only a handful of confirmed bird casualties, the military retreated. That's right, the emus won. Officially, Australia declared defeat. Unofficially, the emus marched on, wild, victorious, and probably laughing in bird. The government tried to downplay it, called it a management error. But history remembers it for what it was, a full-blown war against birds. And the birds, they absolutely dominated. So if today you feel like your obstacles are sprinting away from you, like you've fired every metaphorical bullet and the problems still keep running, take heart. At least you didn't declare war on emus and lose, because someone already did. Now, as the dust settles and the feathers float gently to the ground, we'll drift back even further in time, to a moment when humanity wasn't fighting birds or throwing corpses in court. Next up, the invention of things that changed the world, completely by accident. Because sometimes the best ideas start with a total oops. Sometimes history is shaped by visionaries, and sometimes it's shaped by people who spilled something at the right time and said, wait a minute. Take penicillin, the first modern antibiotic. It was discovered not through years of research or intentional design, but because Alexander Fleming went on vacation. He left some petri dishes out in his lab, which is already a vibe, and when he came back he noticed that one dish had mold growing on it, and that mold had killed the surrounding bacteria. Most people would have just cleaned the mess. Fleming said, "What if this mold is magic?" And it was. That accident saved hundreds of millions of lives, all thanks to a man who didn't tidy up before leaving town. Then there's the microwave. Percy Spencer, an engineer working on radar during World War II, was standing near an active magnetron when he realized that the chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. Now most of us would think, weird. Probably a sign to stand somewhere else. But Spencer thought, I should point this at food. And that's how, within a few years, we had microwave ovens, born from radar, radiation, and one very gooey candy bar. Need something more delicious? The popsicle was invented by an 11-year-old boy named Frank Epperson in 1905, who left a cup of soda water with a stirring stick on the porch overnight. The next morning, frozen snack. Boom. Innovation. He didn't patent it until he was an adult, but kids everywhere still owe him one. There's also potato chips, created out of spite. In 1853, a chef named George Crumb got annoyed when a customer kept complaining that his French fries were too thick. So Crumb sliced the potatoes as thin as possible, fried them to a crisp, and drowned them in salt, just to be petty. The customer loved them, and the potato chip was born from vengeance. And perhaps the coziest accidental invention of all, the slinky. In the 1940s, an engineer named Richard James was trying to create springs that would stabilize naval equipment. He knocked one off a shelf and watched as it gracefully stepped its way down a stack of books, like it had a tiny, wobbly little soul. And instead of saying, "Oops," he said, "Let's market that." Within a few years, millions of slinkies were sold, and people were entertained by a metal coil that did nothing but fall with flair. So tonight, if you feel like your plans aren't working out, if you spilled something or messed up or completely missed the mark, remember, some of humanity's finest moments started with a mistake. You never know which little error might turn into legacy, or at least dessert. Now, before we tuck ourselves in completely, let's end our cozy chaos with one final story. A gentle reminder that even in the most powerful families, things can still get very, very messy. Yes, darling, we're ending the night with royal family feuds, because nothing says bedtime quite like tiaras and unresolved tension. The thing about royalty is, it's never just tea and pearls. Behind every crown, there's at least one cousin plotting, an uncle being dramatic, and someone getting imprisoned in a tower just for breathing wrong at dinner. Let's start with the War of the Roses. England's multi-decade family squabble dressed up as a full-blown civil war. On one side, the House of Lancaster. On the other, the House of York. They were basically rival branches of the same royal family, fighting over who got to sit on the throne and wear the world's itchiest robes. Over the course of 30 years, the crown changed hands 7 times. A few kings mysteriously disappeared, and the family tree became less of a lineage and more of a cautionary tale. And how did it end? With Henry VII marrying Elizabeth of York, a Lancaster prince and a York princess, who said, "What if we just kissed instead of killing each other?" And so the feud ended in a romantic political truce, which is basically the medieval version of a Netflix finale. But England's not the only place where royal drama bloomed like an overwatered orchid. In Russia, we had Peter the Great, who modernized the empire, built cities, and also had his own son tortured to death for treason. So yes, even monarchs with reformist vibes were not above casually turning Thanksgiving into an interrogation. Then there was Queen Christina of Sweden, who gave up the throne in the 1600s because she was sick of politics, refused to marry, and wanted to move to Rome and think deeply about art. Her family? Confused. Her advisors? Furious. Christina, unbothered, living her best life in velvet capes and philosophical solitude. Or how about Empress Wu Zetian of China? She began as a concubine and ended up running the entire Tang dynasty, partly by eliminating rivals, manipulating palace politics like a chessboard, and casually replacing her own sons when they became inconvenient. Do not cross Empress Wu. She will outmaneuver you, then write poetry about it. And if you're in the mood for truly bonkers royal energy, look no further than Ludwig II of Bavaria, a king so obsessed with castles, fantasy, and operas that he practically bankrupted his kingdom trying to build a real-life fairy tale. He rarely attended council meetings. Instead, he rode around in a gold sleigh and commissioned swan-shaped furniture. Eventually, his ministers declared him mentally unfit to rule. Ludwig, unbothered, still building castles. And here's the thing. Every single one of these feuds, dramas, and royal tantrums started with people just trying to hold on to power, approval, or control. So if your family's group chat is getting tense, or your sibling still hasn't forgiven you for that thing you did at Grandma's birthday in 2012, just remember, no one's been thrown in a tower yet. And that, dear dreamer, brings us to the end of tonight's very strange journey. You've wandered through powdered wigs, dancing plagues, edible scandals, and bird-related military disasters. You've survived dinner with petty kings and learned that humanity, throughout all of history, has mostly just been winging it. So tonight, let go of perfection. Let go of the checklist, the overthinking, the mental spreadsheets. You are not behind. You are not a mess. You are simply a human. And history has always been one big, ridiculous bedtime story. Sleep deeply now, wrapped in cozy chaos, and wake knowing you're doing better than a pope yelling at a skeleton. Good night, fellow historian of nonsense. You made it.